for joining me today. My name is Dr. Matthew Teutsch, and I am here with Malaka Gharib, who is the author of I Was Their American Dream, which I'm using in my class this semester. And I actually just came across her work in this book when I was looking for books to actually teach this semester, because it's a multi-ethnic American literature course, and I typically do African-American literature. I do George Takei and Justin Eisinger and Harmony Becker, I believe is her name. They called us Enemy. And then No Boy, John Akota. And then one of the areas that I lack in specifically is Arab American, Asian American, specifically Arab American. I do like an Asian American as well. So I always try and choose a book that's Arab American, Muslim American, and trying to educate myself as I educate the students. And when I looked up Arab American graphic novels, I came across her book, which was actually just published, and picked it up and decided to use it based off of the first few pages because it fit a lot of the themes we were discussing in our class. So I'm recording this for the class, but also for the broader public so you can enjoy it as well. And if you haven't picked up her book, make sure you pick it up. And we're just going to take some time and talk about it. So thank you for joining me. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And also, I love the backstory of your class. That sounds like a wonderful class, and I wish I had taken something like that when I was in college.
Well, I hope the students enjoy it too. We're doing, we just did Alverna Ball's and Stacey Robinson's Across the Tracks, and we're doing Chuck Brown, Sanford Green, and David Walker's Bitter Root next week. So I really hope they enjoy that. So if you're listening to this later, we've already done it, but those are coming up. So let's just get going. One thing that I really like to do is actually use graphic memoirs in class. Now I've realized this, I didn't realize it at first, but you actually titled this a graphic memoir. So I discussed with them, of course, the difference between what a comic would be, a graphic novel, and then a graphic memoir. And I Was Their American Dream is a graphic memoir. So we have to talk about, of course, the art of comics and graphic novels and sequential art. And this uses the juxtaposition of text and visual illustrations, as Scott McCloud talks about, to convey the narrative. So the question is, why did you choose to present your story as a graphic memoir rather than, say, prose or even poetry? And then what are the benefits for you of presenting it in this way?
Sure, that's a great question. Oftentimes, I feel like since I was a kid, I would draw and write in my diaries. When I was having a really bad day, I would draw a picture of myself with like a scowl face and like X's over my eyes and like a squirgly mouth, sort of expressing my frustration about the day. And that was like part of these little illustrations and drawings and doodles on the side of my notebooks became part of the fabric of how I expressed myself, not just when I was writing in my diary. And then I can't believe that he did that! Exclamation mark, exclamation mark, exclamation mark! I also realized that handwriting and the way that you write has a profound way of also expressing itself. And I also became really fascinated by the fact that a single line can contain so much expression. And I love the idea of how could you minimalistically express an idea with like the fewest lines possible, the fewest words possible, and then just make it, like, what can you say with as few words and lines and strokes as possible? And I felt that comics were like the natural, I guess, like medium for someone like me who was interested in those types of things. Comics was a natural medium. So comics is all about the economy of like trying to say things. Like everything it means something on the page because you don't really have that much space, right?
Right.
Just kind of have like the page and you've got to get what you want to say down, and you can't do it in like 500 pages. Well, you can if you wanted to, but I certainly didn't. I also like the interplay between what a narration says with what the image says and what the dialogue says. All three of those have to work in tandem together to sort of express one single idea. So each of the three items have to be doing something different. I also like how you have to account for time when you're telling a story in a comic through the space and the number of panels. For me, drawing comics is like figuring out a giant puzzle, like trying to like put together making it feels like doing a crossword puzzle or like like playing a game where the challenge is, okay, you've got this much space to like tell this story. And so how are you going to tell the story in what details are you going to exclude and what details are you going to include and how are you going to express that? It just seems, it's like such a fun way to express I mean, for me to like express my story. So
Yeah, and
I think that
you have that limited space, like you said. Like, I've never drawn a comic, and I remember in high school, writing on my cons and writing on, on my in my notebook, but never really did like anything, comic oriented. I used to trace like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and stuff like that. And then I fell out of comics, of course, till I got older and started, over the past few years, actually starting to collect and starting to have pull lists and starting to do graphic novels and use them in class and things like that. But that economy, I think, is important for especially readers. And most of my students haven't read a comic, or if they have, it's been a long time. Getting them to think about that interplay and that economy of space. I was mentioning before we started recording, I was rereading this yesterday, and it doesn't have anything to the story, but you have a moment where you're going to your first job and the woman's holding the TPS report. Like, it's just like a little Easter egg. It doesn't have anything to the story, but if you get the reference to Office Space, it adds kind of a feeling to that whole office space and that whole office interaction that you had with her, right?
yes.
So just kind of moments like that. And then also when you're talking about the time, that first page, you're going to school. I don't remember how old you are at this point, but you see your mom and you looking at, and then you do a close up of your face, and then you looking out of the window. And then it's one panel, but kind of three panels if you would space it out, if you get out of the car and waving. And then even within that, you have one of your panels kind of flipping up like a picture, off of the page. It's just kind of those little things. And then your use of photographs on the next page, which of course is what interested me at first.
That's what's fun about comics, is that you can slip in a lot of even your drawings start to have a personality, and even your style starts personality. Like,
right.
One thing that I love to do is I put Scotch tape at the edges of my
right.
of my photos that I draw. So like, let's say I draw a photo, I always put Scotch tape at the edges, because I just like that quirky detail of like, it makes it kind of look old timey. And it's actually a throwback to Marissa Moss, who is the illustrator of the Amelia's Notebook series. And actually, that was her style, putting the Scotch tape on photos. And so when I finally got to meet her in person, I showed her that, and she was like, "Oh, that's totally me." And I was like, "Yes, I stole that from you."
What did Moss do? I haven't heard of her.
Oh, she did in the 1990s. She did the American Girl series, Amelia's Notebooks.
Okay.
And they were more targeted to like tweens, but as a kid, I loved them.
Yeah, I haven't seen those. My daughter was into American Girl for a while, and she had the books, but I don't remember seeing those. I don't think she has them anymore.
Yeah, I'm trying to look for mine. Yeah, it's a classic. I stole a lot of ideas from her.
Well, that leads me to have another question, or actually, let me back up real quick. I was looking through here on page 17 too, when you're talking about kind of the way comics work, and your mom with her job, right?
Yeah.
When she's working at the I forget where it was, at the Best Western.
Yeah.
But you have the watch, and the way we read that, moving around from the top to the right, to the bottom, back over to the left, right? So moving as like it's a watch, and moving that time, just that visual way of doing it. And I know when my students read Bitter Root, I was rereading some of those issues today. Sanford Green kind of does some of those same things a little bit with some of the ways he does it, with some of the fight scenes. But I was going to ask you, going back to the pictures, are these pictures that you're looking at in the drawer, are those based off of real pictures?
Yes, they are. They are based off of real pictures.
And why did you choose to draw the pictures instead of putting them in there as actual pictures? Because I just reread Spiegelman's Mouse too, and he has a picture of his dad in a concentration camp uniform, right? Like an actual picture.
Yeah, I mean, I included pictures in the high school.
Yeah.
Like toward the middle of the book. So there was a moment when I put pictures in, and I realize now it was probably a missed opportunity to put pictures, like real pictures in. However, I always think that like the artist's interpretation of a picture can provide more textural context and emotional context than just putting the picture itself, because then you know how I feel about the picture in the way that I draw it. The pictures on page, I guess this page, the pictures of my parents feel very warm, and you get the sense from young me looking at them, that if you have an affinity toward the pictures, and if they were just a regular, like a photo, like the actual photograph, I don't think that you'd get as much rich detail, emotional detail.
It reminds me of something that Lillian Smith talks about, and that I've thought about a lot, is the way we think about memory. And she kind of says that memory is like a paintbrush. We paint on it what we want, and we kind of feel like it. She says, and I disagree with her on this, that photographs give us the true meaning. I still think that photographs are painted to a certain extent, but I really kind of like that idea. And I've noticed that a lot in graphic memoirs, that there's the use of photographs with Kristen Radke's work, with Spiegelman, with you, with others too. There's just this use of photographs to bring out kind of this this personal aspect. And one thing before I forget that I'm reminded of too, and I'm not gonna be able to pronounce them, but looking on page 9 with the signs, and I may need you to pronounce it for me, but Laban.
Oh yeah, that's right.
For fight.
Yes.
And then also, and we can probably come back to this, but just before I forget, and then that's the Egyptian word for the Arabic word for what? For milk?
Oh wait, I'm trying to look for which page
cheat
for
sheet.
that.
Where's it at? And I know it's probably not pronounced the same way. I don't know where it is.
Yellow. Let's go.
What page is it?
I don't have page numbers, but I'm not doing that for my next book. It's the one where growing up in Cairo in the 1970s, my dad was obsessed with American movies. Yalla, or was it when my dad saying Alhamdulillah?
No. It's further back, where they're actually where you have words in Arabic and words in Tagalog too.
Oh.
I remember it's on the left-hand side of the page. I know that.
Is it in chapter 2?
I think it's further back. It could be.
Okay.
But anyways, I noticed that there was an Arabic word that was the same, but it was for food.
Oh, I remember that page now. Yes, there are a lot of similarities.
Page 38.
Okay, page 38. Let's see.
Yeah, for milk.
Leban. No, that's Leban and Laban. Totally different words.
But they're spelled the same, right?
They are spelled the same, but in Arabic, it probably wouldn't be spelled the same.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
It just kind of stood out to me. It's like, that's really interesting, because that leads us to, of course, the other question, which I kind of want to get to. And I'm a white male Southerner. I have my Louisiana shirt on. And I'm from Louisiana, and your husband is from Tennessee, right? Darren?
Tennessee for 200 years.
FYI, that has to be my favorite page of y'all's wedding.
Oh.
With the Filipino, Egyptian, American, Southern Baptist, Muslim wedding.
Yes.
Anyway.
Darren's granddaddy actually married us, and he's a Southern Baptist minister, and he delivered our sermon, and he like mixed in Muslim and Christian concepts together. It was really cool.
And as someone who grew up Southern Baptist, I kind of love that idea of the Southern Baptist grandfather pastor doing that.
Yes.
But it leads me to another page. So I like the page where you talk about your observation about Southerners. And I showed that somebody today who's from the Midwest, and she's like, I don't necessarily agree with all these, but that's
really?
Yeah. Well, that kind of leads me to my question.
Uh-huh.
So you have all these observations about Southerners, and then you point out, and this isn't really my question, but the point of that is this: like, Louisiana is the South. And everything from Louisiana and South Louisiana specifically is totally different from Northeast Georgia, right? Or totally different from Tennessee. Like, our foodways are different, a lot of the cultural connections are different.
Right.
So it's really even interesting to think about within, or I'm assuming even in the Philippines or in Egypt, different regions of the countries, right?
Yes.
They're different. But what I love about this page is you turn the page, and then you point out some of the similarities between Southerners in the United States, Filipinos, and Egyptians, specifically with religion, with hospitality, and things like that. And you do this as well a little bit earlier, albeit a little bit different with the checklist, the Filipino, Egyptian, and American cultures, early in the book. So can you talk some about these moments and about the importance of us recognizing that beneath the surface, what many perceive as differences in cultures, we find strong similarities, and I think Darren's grandfather kind of shows that, if you want to talk about him, because I'd love to hear about that personally, but just,
Yeah. So I think one thing that as somebody who grew up with many different cultures in many different cultural contexts, like growing up in Los Angeles and also Cairo, and then living, on the East Coast, like, and like espousing so many different cultures, it's like you kind of learn to have a very deep sensitivity for other people's cultures, and that also includes like even amongst white culture in the United States. And I think I really like trying to pinpoint those differences, but also I like pinpointing the commonalities too. Part of the reason why I first married Darren was that he had a lot of he felt like somebody who could have been part of Filipino culture, like the things that his values. He's very family oriented. He's very polite. He's very kind. These are like traits that Southern gentlemen like have. Right?
yeah,
And those are the things. He grew up in a religious household, so my family was like so happy about that. But when I broke it down and realized that, I was like, oh, that's why my family likes Darren, because he feels very familiar he feels like a very familiar person to them. And now I'm living in Nashville. I moved during the pandemic from DC to Nashville. And I have also learned too that Tennessean culture is different from Atlanta, different from Louisiana. We have our own very, very specific culture within the context of the South. So the South isn't just one big behemoth.
right.
But I find a lot of markers for home here because I'm searching for them, and I'm trying to keep my ears up and be aware of the things that bring us together, I guess. I think with, comparing, like, when I first met my mother-in-law, she had a very, very deep Southern accent. And one of the first things that she did for me was host a bridal shower for me, where she had women all dressed up coming in and eating finger sandwiches with pimento cheese and like mints and like tea and sweet tea. And it was so wild for me. I felt like I was having culture shock. But it just reminded me a lot of my aunties, like on both of my Filipino and my Egyptian side. So if I try to find the commonalities, that feels like I can belong in that context also.
And I think that's key, is finding the commonalities. My grandmother used to eat pimento cheese all the time, and I never ate it. And then I had it. I think I had some about a month or two ago, and I was like, "Oh, I could eat this." So, but I love the fact too. You mentioned the Southern accent, and I'm from North Louisiana originally, which is totally different than South Louisiana. Where I'm from, I say is more like Texas. Then I look at it, it's more like East Texas, because it's on I-20, and it's Shreveport. It's about 3 hours from Dallas, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like maybe 20 or 30 minutes from the Texas border too. So it's kind of like East Texas. In Houston and kind of that I-10 area would be more like South Louisiana. And South Louisiana is totally different from North Louisiana. But I remember watching, say, like Swamp People or something on History Channel, and them having to like do the subtitles for the Cajun speakers, right?
Wow.
But I remember meeting somebody too from Alabama, and their Southern accent was so thick, I couldn't understand a thing. It took me a while to kind of understand, what they were saying. So like I was saying, even within kind of those regions, it's fascinating, but you have the similarities because you're both from the South too, right?
Right.
And you both ask for Coke when you go to the store, or you ask for sweet tea, or you ask for tea and you get sweet tea. There's none of this unsweet crap, mm-hmm. All these types of things. And I think, the more we kind of look at the similarities, and I would even say, between Muslim and Christian similarities too, things I'm starting to dive into, you see that we have more commonalities than we have differences. I think that's important. Yeah. I love that.
Yeah, I would also like for, people to, if somebody in the South who, well, even for Darren, my husband, like when we first met, it was also a culture shock for him to come home to Southern California with me and be in an all Asian community.
Right.
be the only white person around with a lot of other Filipino people. And I also imagine that he would have to dig into everything that he and all of his upbringing, and try to find commonalities with my family as well. And imagine dropping him into Cairo, Egypt. He's an affable guy, and he was able to float, I think, there by also just finding commonalities, common ground.
Well, I mean, that leads me to kind of the other question, and it's that question of whiteness, which you address at
Yes.
various points. And this book is a detail of your own journey towards embracing your identity. And in the process, you point out, a lot of the fallacies that we learn about here in America, notably the myth of the American dream, which you talk about in my class, and I would say the glorification through media of whiteness, which thankfully people have been pushing back on that for a long time, and it's starting to change a lot more recently. But that glorification through the media of whiteness is the standard for beauty, because you mentioned watching Felicity and wanting to be like them, going to Syracuse and being surrounded by basically just a sea of white people,
Yeah.
And I love the fact, just a little side note too, I love the fact, I don't remember where it is, when you talk at the college, you're like, I couldn't tell any of them apart. Just kind of that reversal of that kind of, aspect too, on page 92. But this discussion of whiteness is the standards for beauty, success, and more. So can you talk about, because I see you as interrogating it. Can you kind of talk about the ways you interrogate that?
I think that what it all came down to at the very end was, I thought that the only way that I be seen as American was to portray as white. That the only way people would see me as a true American would for me to like basically act as white as possible and minimize all of the ways in which I grew up and all of the culture that I had inherited from my parents. And then I just kind of reached this moment when I was examining myself and my story in the book, where did I not also grow up in America too? Like my experience growing up in an Asian enclave is just as American as anybody else's story. And I don't know why that can't be accepted for what that is. Like, it's also very American to say that I'm a Filipino Egyptian American, and this is what an American looks like.
What am I? I'm just an American.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah, exactly.
That was a question I was going to ask you too, because when I was doing Miss Marvel in another class, Hussein Rashid points out, that hyphen's doing a lot of work in these terms. And when you have, Filipino, Egyptian, Muslim, American, whatever, that hyphen's playing a lot of work. So why can't I be, Southern white Louisiana cisgender American? I'm just American. So that question of what is American and what is truly American, I think that's a lot of the not even debates. I think that's a lot of the crap we're dealing with today, is people trying to define that American as that whiteness, which is nothing new.
Exactly. Right. It isn't anything new, but I also feel like, I'm 35 years old, and when I wrote the book, I was 30, maybe 30. Yeah. And that was actually the first time for me that I had been thinking critically about my own race. I wasn't like, things had changed in this country that forced me to re-examine my own relationship with my immigrant identity. I never had to do that before because I wasn't in a place where I felt like I needed to. But for the first time I did. And although that my findings are no surprise, hey, I'm American too. That was huge for me to finally emotionally come to a place where I could say that and actually believe that. I think is tremendous. And I think that I know that it doesn't seem, some of the earliest criticisms of my book was she's not saying anything new. But the thing is that, like, for me, it's very new. And this book is for me, so I could figure that out. And for other people who may be similarly on that beginning journey.
Well, that's kind of my other question too, because what you mentioned there, I think, is important for students or anybody to realize. What's kind of the importance of writing, no matter if you write a graphic novel or whatever, even just journaling or diarying or blogging or whatever. what does that do? Ernest Gaines always says that there's people would ask him, how do you become a better writer? He says there's 6 words: read, 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 write, write, write. Right. And you mentioned some of your influences within comics, but also, what does writing do?
Yeah.
Like how did writing this and illustrating it help you in your journey? Like, how did your journey shift? You have that moment where you talk about the question, what are you? And how your thoughts about that question shift, right?
Yes.
So, like, was there a moment that shifted when you were writing this within your kind of journey?
Before I wrote this book, when I, like, at the beginning stages, I Googled how to write a memoir. And one of the first things that I found was that writing is about discovery. If you don't know, if you have to start on a quest as a writer to try to find out what the story is and what you're trying to say. And if you don't make that discovery in your own writing, then your readers aren't making that discovery either. You need to take your readers on the ride as you write to discover what your central question is. So for me, my central question was like, why, like I wanted to know how I felt about being Filipino Egyptian American. And the more and more I wrote, I felt like the more I had like 500 more questions that I wanted to ask. It's like, my parents, why did they come to this country? Okay, so what did they have? What did they plan for themselves? What was their big plan for me? Do I have the same plan for myself that my parents did? How do they feel about being Filipino and Egyptian? How do I feel about being Filipino and Egyptian? And like, the more that I ask these questions, like you can kind of see these moments where like, oh, she's having a come to Jesus moment. Like there was this one moment where I was like, I want people to pronounce my name correctly. Or like, I want to eat a sandwich for lunch. Like I want to eat rice, and it's like, I don't want to eat this stupid bagel that's hollowed out, like with all those other white girls are doing it, at school. I want to eat like, like I was having these very these moments where it's like I was like trying to break free from like these things that I was thinking that I had to do or should do, and you can kind of feel that like tension, I think, on the pages.
I can't commiserate with your love of spam, but I love that you use that, and that's to me a very American dish, or a very American thing.
There's a whole backstory on spam colonization in the Asian world. So yes.
Do you want to say a thing or two about that real quick?
Well, the Americans, when they colonized the Philippines, with them, they brought spam, and Filipinos, because they thought that outsiders and white people were like, superior in class, they tried to emulate the Americans and eat what they were eating, and what they were eating was spam. So
yeah. Well, I mean, that's a whole discussion we can have in class. Thank you for that, because that's definitely a discussion with my students that we will have. There's a couple more questions I have, and one actually has to do with the comics. And one thing I love too is seeing like Bad Brains t-shirts, the Germs. I didn't listen to Germs much. A huge Nirvana fan, and of course Pat Smear played with them later and stuff like that. I saw a video of you earlier. I thought it was a Nirvana shirt, but it was a Hawaii shirt. So I was like, oh.
It was a joke Nirvana shirt.
Okay, it was a joke Nirvana shirt. Okay, so that's good. So I was like, okay,
yeah,
that album, Nevermind's 30 this year. God bless.
Can you believe that guy sued?
Yeah, that's a whole other story too. Anyways,
so petty.
I still love In Utero, still the best album.
So good, so good.
So all right, so throughout the book, and I thought about this when you were talking about comics too, because you talk about the zine, you talk about zines and a very DIY culture with punk culture and zine culture and things like that. But what I love about this book too, and not all graphic memoirs have this, but yours does, and there's actually pages in here that you can interact with, that you could actually, they're not perforated, but you can like cut them out, like Darren's, Tagalog words, his flashcards. I've seen a lot of books with recipes, and even when you have the recipe, you have it kind of folded, just kind of those, texture type things, the code of conduct, the Malaka paper dolls, the, make your own zine. So what was the impetus for kind of doing those things, for having those activities? And, how are comics and graphic memoirs uniquely positioned, I guess I would say, to provide readers with kind of that interactive experience? Because it's very interactive, I would
Remember
say.
I was talking about like the economy of like trying to get across what you're trying to say with like the fewest concepts possible.
Yeah.
And I think for me, I wanted you to get to know me by playing with me. You play with me. You come into my world. I'm going to ask you some quiz questions. You circle them. Like, here's a game that you can play. Put yourself in my shoes. Like, here's how to play this game Fruit. I don't know what to wear in college. You dress me up. Like, what would you have decided? I want people I want to bring people into my world and to feel the dilemmas that I was feeling. And the best way I could do that is to play with my readers, literally play with them.
Yeah. I mean, you're asking us to actually cut out paper dolls of you.
And I also,
asking us to,
in a way too, it's like these are things that I enjoy. Like, I enjoy making zines, I enjoy making paper dolls. So like, you're also getting a sense of like who I am as a person too, in the type of games that I offer.
but just don't do the evil sand trap. Is that right?
The evil sand trap. That's like,
somebody would get hurt doing that.
Yes.
And the fruit card game reminds me of war.
It's probably war, actually. This is probably, we called it war. We called it fruit in Arabic. So, fawah.
And just looking through here, there's a lot more I could ask you. I mean, even about going on vacation in the Mediterranean while the Second Intifada is going on. I mean,
yeah,
I can't imagine that. Just there's so much in here that I think is just important for my students to think about, and especially my students are educators, and this is a book I think that they could use with definitely their high school students. And was that kind of your thought as well, possibly to have educators use this within their classroom?
I never imagined in 1,000 anyone would ever care about this book except for me.
But that's part of writing too, right? It is for yourself.
When I was writing this book, I was really thinking about trying to like sort out my own issues. And like, I love the idea of having like 2 years, or maybe like it was a year and a half, to like really just like sit and think about one central question and turn it into a body of work. I mean, part of what it means to be an artist is to like express yourself through art. And I often, this is so cheesy, but I do think about like, what am I trying to say first, and like, if anybody else can benefit from my realizations, and that's so amazing. But I never expect other people to care, and I'm really glad that they are. And I'm really glad that the book has like, I can't believe how many high schools and colleges have made this like core reading or teaching it in class. I've seen people write like book reports about me, and when I Google my name now, it's like it's all like questions that teachers are asking, like, where does Malaka Gharib like currently live? Where does Malaka Gharib? How old is she? It's like, I feel like those are questions that the teachers had asked them to do, and I think it's so wonderful. And I was telling my family in my first event that I did for this book that like, I think like it's such a tremendous honor to go from feeling like my story didn't matter as a Filipino Egyptian person to then having my story be read by so many thousands and thousands of people, being studied and analyzed, and that's all my family. It's crazy. It's an honor.
Well, that's what you said, and you repeated it throughout, that it's writing for you.
Yes.
You're asking the question, it's the self-discovery.
Yes.
Whenever I write, I work on different projects, but, I write my blog twice a week. And I realize when I start off with just kind of a question or an idea, and then when I write, that's when the answers start to come, right? And you start to kind of dig more, maybe into yourself or maybe into whatever you're looking at. And I think that's what's important. And then what people can take away from that I think is important too. And the fact that it does reach and connect with people, I think is important. I think like I said, what makes me connect with this a lot is the fact that you're talking about yourself as the daughter of immigrants. You're questioning a lot of the things that we need to question as Americans who are, as Americans, and I would say as the world too, because that leads me to my last question. I have students read Susan Farr's Leaves from the Mineral Portfolio over Eurasian. And there's a quote at the end of that essay that I always go to. And this was an essay that she wrote in 1909, where she discusses her own identity as the daughter of a Chinese mother and a British father. And she's viewed as Chinese. And of course, this is the Chinese Exclusion Act, anti-immigration, specifically against Chinese and other Asians during that period, the Yellow Peril. And at the end of her essay, she writes this: after all, I have no nationality and I'm not anxious to claim any. I think when I looked her up on Wikipedia, it was Chinese, British, Canadian, something. I mean, that was like the list, because she was, they think they moved to Canada. But she said, after all, I have no nationality and I'm not anxious to claim any. Individuality is more than nationality. And I've thought about this a lot. Most notably, when you discuss the question that one would ask during high school or college, what are you? I always think when I see that question, it's different from the question I think about. I think of the question of where are you from? Mm-hmm. And we've moved a lot of places. We've lived in the South our whole life, from my wife and family, from Louisiana, North Louisiana to South Louisiana to Auburn, Alabama. We went to Norway for a year on a Fulbright, and then we came back to Georgia, or then we came to Georgia. And then we moved back to Georgia. People ask, where are you from? And I'm like, so how do I answer that? Am I from Norway? Was I there? Am I from Alabama? Am I from? So it's really this kind of convoluted, long answer. And all these places, just like all your Filipino side, your Egyptian side, I would even say Darren's, Tennessee side, all impact you and form what you are. I would assume, and that's kind of how I feel with that question of where you're from. But can you talk about that question and the ways in which Farr's quote illuminates your own experiences?
Yeah, it's a beautiful quote. After all, I have no nationality. And I'm not anxious to claim any. Individuality is more than nationality. I think for the longest time, I rejected the Filipino and Egyptian parts of myself in favor of whiteness. And I wanted to believe that mattered, that my Filipino and Egyptian side didn't really matter and wasn't part of my, especially as a high school kid, like I was like a punk, that's how I identified myself first and foremost. Punk, yeah, exactly. Professor now, right?
Yeah. And you do stuff for NPR now, right?
Yeah, I do. I know, right? It's like not even, okay. It's not the coolest. All right. So I think I just want to be at a place where I can be proud of my Filipino and Egyptian heritage without having to minimize it or without having to minimize it. This question, people ask this question all the time, like, how do I feel about the what are you question? But I don't know why it seems harder and harder to answer every time. I just want to say a few things. In a town like Cerritos, where I grew up, the question what are you is a very important question, because obviously you never want to mix somebody who is like from El Salvador up with somebody who is from Mexico or Bangladesh with Pakistan. It's such a multicultural place that you had to have some cultural sensitivity about who people were. Granted, I don't think anybody wanted to identify as I never wanted to identify as Filipino or Egyptian, because I thought that I want people to see me as white as possible, which is horrible. And I do think that individuality is more than nationality, but I think that we do a service by saying who we are and what ethnicity we are when we introduce ourselves to people, because then people can see that this is also American,
I agree with that. I think for me, I think I've had this kind of thought of, what's the purpose of borders? for
Yeah.
one. It kind of gets into that question with me a little bit, but I think about when I think of nationality, I may change that for me personally to be more cultural, right? Because like I said, even within America and even within most nations, you have different cultural regions. Like I said, I still think about Louisiana because North Louisiana is Protestant. If we're talking religion, cultural, Protestant. Foodways are a little bit different. South Louisiana is Catholic, and foodways are a little bit different, influenced by the enslaved from Africa and came from the Caribbean, and influenced by a lot of different things. So kind of for me, I think kind of culturally is kind of how I think about that, and that individuality and kind of that mixture of cultures. Like we've taken things from Louisiana, from our roots in North Louisiana to South Louisiana. I don't know what we took from Auburn except for football. I'm trying to think.
That's a big part of the culture.
It is.
Football. Oh my God.
But in Louisiana, football is a big part of the culture too. So it's not like it was that different. But I've never been to an SEC school for one. I worked at Auburn for 2 years and it was insane. I mean, it was fun. But especially when they beat Georgia on my birthday, that was a fun game. But anyways, that's one. But then went to Norway, right? Like we brought things back from Norway. We have Christmas traditions that we brought from Norway, like rice pudding. Taking, and then from Georgia, like just taking the things from the different places you lived forms into your identity. I think forms into kind of your culture. I would say you're making your cultural identity. Yes. That's kind of how I view that, I would say, especially with her quote.
Right. I guess now if I had to say, who am I? Gosh. I think I would say I'm like I think the South has become like a really big part of my identity now that I live here for like 1 year. But
so DC is not the South?
No, I don't know where people get that idea from. DC is not the South.
Don't they say Maryland's the South? I don't think it is.
Maryland's the South, I think. People say Maryland.
But DC is right next to Maryland and Virginia.
I know. People like to say that we're the East Coast.
Okay. But I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just asking.
Yeah. Well, DC is nowhere near like somewhere like Tennessee, that's for sure.
No, I agree.
But yeah, I feel like I identify so strongly with the South, and like I also want to, now that I'm here, I feel like I want to ID myself more with Nashville because I think that Nashville broke a lot of stereotypes for me actually living here. I thought it was going to be a place where I couldn't find fellow immigrant children like me, and there's just so many here, and they're doing wonderful things. And I think that the world should know that. Well, I proudly say I'm from Nashville.
That's kind of like me here. I mean, I moved here and I looked at the demographics and I was like, what? It was crazy. Like this, I wouldn't say skewing, but the amount of the percentage of whites compared to others. And then when I moved here, finding the Latino community from one. There's a Laotian community.
Wow.
Finding, and I'm not connected, but there's a small, I think there's a Buddhist temple here, and this is Northeast Georgia, right? So wow. Finding kind of those types of things, shows you that one movement for one, and there's other issues we know, of course, with labor, with all of this, but it shows you that you're a lot more connected than you kind of think you are as well with other parts of the world.
Oh yeah.
I think that's what's key is we have to realize that we are connected. And that brings me back to the other thing you talk about. We have a lot more similarities than we have differences.
Absolutely.
We just express them in different ways.
Yes. But also it's good to celebrate those differences too. I think like, I had Darren's mom who is Southern Baptist and Darren over.
You have a dog too.
I have a dog too. We had a Muslim iftar feast for Ramadan, and it was really for Eid, sorry, and it was really cute. She was just like very supportive and great, and I was like, you know what, this is like, look at me having an Eid feast like with my Southern family. It's great.
With your Southern Baptist family. That's the
Southern Baptist family, but that is America. That is America right there. Like just being able to do that, like so good, so right, and it should have always been like this.
I agree. So thank you for spending time with me today.
Thank you. Thank you so much.